of people who just live in poverty. Thank you so much. In their daily life, and I found a couple stats this week. And roughly 9% of the world's population goes to bed hungry at night. 9% of the world goes to bed tonight and they don't have enough food to eat. In some areas of the world, though, that percentage is a lot higher than in other areas of the world. So in some places, it's more like 22%, like sub-Saharan Africa. 22% of the people don't have enough food to eat at night. Unemployment is a big deal in a lot of parts of the world. So in South Africa, I think it's Cape Town, the unemployment rate is 35% of the people can't find work. And it's good for us to stop and pause. And I think we live in a part of the world that, in comparison, is kind of affluent. And a lot of times we just don't see the poverty that actually does exist. But it's interesting to me, any country in the world you go to, any state in our country that you go to, you will find people who don't have enough money. And it's interesting how controversial it can be. How do we think about those who are poor? What do we do to help? Sometimes it's kind of hard to know what to do. The Bible really speaks into this, and it gives us some wisdom, I think. It kind of shoots straight. The Bible gives us real wisdom. One error that the Bible teaches us to avoid, and we'll see it tonight, is the error of being kind of hard-hearted. There can be a hard-heartedness when it comes to how do I think about those who are destitute. Some people think, well, the only explanation for why someone is poor is that they're just not trying hard enough. They're not working hard enough. And so that's really the only reason someone would be poor in today's world. Why would I help someone who isn't trying hard enough? There can be kind of a hard-heartedness. Or in a similar vein, you can kind of have this idea, well, the poor are always going to be out there, and I'm not a billionaire, and even if I dedicated my life to helping the poor, it's not even going to make a dent, so why do anything? That's an error, and some of the Proverbs we're going to look at tonight rebukes someone with a hard heart towards the poor. It's not a sin to be poor. I think that's important to remember. Some people in life are born into terrible situations, especially as you think globally, and it's not a sin to be poor. It's not necessarily a sign that God is displeased with you. If you do believe that, that's maybe kind of a form of prosperity gospel to watch out for. So that's an error that we find addressed here, and it's rebuked, a hard-heartedness. But there's another error as well, and it's this. Some people have this error when it comes to the way they think about the poor. Some people deny that laziness ever has anything to do with poverty. This error says, if you're poor, the only explanation can be that it's the fault of the system. That's the only explanation. And so the solution is you blame the system, and you make the system carry all the burdens for you. And the Bible kind of rebukes it. I just love the Bible's pretty blunt to both of these two errors. The Bible says things like this. Look, if you are a lazy person who refuses to work, you're going to be poor. And it's on you. That's your fault. And it's a pretty blunt rebuke. The Bible also rebukes the other side of the equation, the other hard heart that says, you know what, the poor, they're just lazy. That's the only reason you're poor is because you're lazy. And it says this, if you close your ear to the poor, then when you're in need, you are going to be the one that no one's helping. So the Bible really helps us think through some of these things. So let's dive in here to kind of the first thing is here, the first blank, talking about poverty, the harsh realities of being poor. It's hard to be poor. And sometimes I wonder if I guess, as I've been studying about this week, I'm thinking, do I think enough about the poor and what it's like to be poor and how to help the poor? I guess I'm wondering, do I think enough about that? It's hard to be poor. And I think one of the reasons that we see a lot of verses about poverty in Proverbs, especially in these 3 chapters, one of the things Solomon's trying to do in this book is he's trying to warn the youth about the realities of life. And so is it a little bit like a dad who takes his son or his daughter to a homeless shelter? And not to mock the people there, but to kind of expose like, hey, there are paths in life that are really hard. And it's good to kind of see that. So Proverbs 1:4 says, the book's written, quote, to give prudence to the naive and to the youth, knowledge and discretion. And so I think that's just one kind of basic goal, is to expose us to it's hard to be poor. That's a hard path. But I think there's another reason that we're seeing some verses about the hardship of being poor, and it's meant to inspire compassion. As you read some of these verses, like, wow, I need to have a heart for those who are poor. So let's look at a couple of the Proverbs about poverty. One verse says this, wealth brings many friends, many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friend. This is from Proverbs 19:7. It says, all a poor man's brothers hate him. How much more do his friends go far from him? In other words, to be poor is not just to lack money, it's to lack respect and to lack friends. And that is a hard road to walk in life. And I think it's good, especially for a youth, to kind of see, hey, I should work hard in life and avoid that, but also to inspire compassion to those who are poor. Part of the hardship of poverty, I think, is that you are kind of alone. There's a difficulty of being so far on the bottom of the totem pole that a lot of people look at you and say, you know what, you just don't have a lot to offer society. And so why would I waste my time with you? That's part of the hardship of being poor. So that's one thing we see with poverty, just it's hard. The second thing we find about poverty is this: godly people give to the poor. There are a lot of reasons that people are poor. One of them is laziness. We'll see that in a minute. But that is not the only reason for poverty. Some people truly have been harmed by others to such an extent that they're living in poverty. In our world today, there's millions of people who are living in poverty, and it's not their fault. They can't feed their kids, and it's not the wrong that they have done. One of the things I love about Jesus specifically is that he has a heart for the poor. He has a heart for the poor. When he comes to earth, he's born into a poor family, a family who at one point they're refugees in a foreign country. Jesus associates with the lonely. And so one of the reasons I think it's such a big deal to oppress the poor in the Bible is that it's kind of like God's like, hey, look, don't mess with them, because you mess with them, you mess with me. God has a heart for the poor. And if God has compassion on the poor, shouldn't we as well? So some Proverbs commend those who are generous to the poor. Proverbs 19:17 says this: whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will repay him for his deed. What a neat image of lending to the Lord, and God blesses you when you are generous to the poor. And this from Proverbs 22:9, it says this: whoever has a bountiful eye will be blessed, for he shares his bread with the poor. I think it's interesting. Both verses are highlighting like God doesn't. He's pleased when we help the poor, to the point where he blesses us when we help them. And so what do we learn about the poor? Well, godly people care about the poor, and godly people give to the poor. There's also a warning to those who would refuse to be generous. This comes from Proverbs 21:13. 13, it says this: whoever closes his ear to the cry of the poor will himself call out and not be answered. And so there's like, hey, be generous to the poor. God will bless you. He'll see that. It's like lending to the Lord. But then there's also this warning. Look, if you decide you're just going to turn off the generosity to the poor switch in your life, like that's a problem. That's not how godly people live. There are difficult questions when it comes to helping the poor. There really are. And I think it takes some wisdom to know what is the best way to help someone who is poor. There are ways that you can, there's a way that you can try to help someone, but it ends up hurting the person. Is there ever a point where someone looks you in the eye and says, I need money, please give me money, and you tell them no? I think there is, but I think the idea always for the Christian is this. Whenever someone comes to me for help, my heart should be one of wanting to help them. Like, I want to help them. I want to go out of my way to do what is good, to do a good turn to them. Sometimes it's hard to know what is a good turn. Someone with a gambling problem, do I just keep lending them money? There's a thought that ought to go into that. But Jesus does say some pretty blunt things about this. In Mark 6, he says, give to everyone who begs from you. And from the one who takes away your goods, do not demand them back. And as you wish that others would do to you, do so to them. And I think that's where I get this idea that the overriding principle here is do unto others as I would hope them do to me. I'm wanting to do good to them. I'm wanting to do them a good turn. Sometimes generosity, you get burned for generosity. Sometimes that does happen. But I think Jesus kind of speaks into that. Like if we get to the point where we say, I'm turning off the generosity switch in my life, like that's kind of a hardness of heart we shouldn't walk into. We are not to close our ears to the poor. In fact, what's the verse in 1 John where it talks about if anyone has the goods of this world and then he sees a brother in need and doesn't help, how can the love of God be in that person? So godly people give to the poor. Then the next thing is this: avoid the paths that lead to poverty. It's not a sin to be poor, but I don't know that we should think it's somehow more honorable to be poor than it is to be rich. And there are certain paths you can take in life that are just really foolish. Paths that you shouldn't take because it leads to poverty. Here's an example. Proverbs 21:17 says this: whoever loves pleasure will be a poor man. He who loves wine and oil will not be rich. Here's what I take away from that. It takes discipline to avoid poverty. It takes discipline. It takes this ability to, you want to buy something and you really want it and you say, no, I'm not going to buy it. It's kind of denying yourself some things that you want. I'd really love to have a new car right now, but I'm going to say no. Or I'd really like to have X, Y, and Z, but it takes some discipline, right? And if you're a person who you just no self-control, if I want it, I buy it, that's a path that leads to poverty. And there's wisdom in recognizing that and saying, look, I'm going to have some self-control. Learn that while you're young, by the way. Learn that while you're young to say, there are things that I'd like to buy, but I don't have the money. I'm going to have self-control. Here's another path to poverty you ought to avoid. It says Proverbs 21:17, it says, the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender. A slave is someone who has lost his freedom. And I'm not saying it's an absolute sin to borrow money. I think you can do it in ways that are wise. But there's a lot of ways that debt is so dangerous. If you're borrowing money that you can't repay when it comes down to it, That is so unwise. It's like you're a slave to the person that you're borrowing money from. You lose your freedom. There's an article from Dave Ramsey's website. It says 46% of Americans say their debt level creates stress and makes them anxious. So many people in our world today are living with unneeded debt, and it's causing them anxiety. It's an unnecessary burden to them. That can be, Proverbs just saying, look, that's a path that can lead to poverty, so avoid that. There's another path to becoming poor, and it's this. It's oppressing the poor. It's oppressing those, taking advantage of people who are poor. Listen to this from Proverbs 22:16. It says, whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. That's a path to poverty, is oppressing those who are poor. Sometimes God will judge someone who is oppressing the poor. So there's a lot of different ways to become poor. By lacking discipline it takes when you want to buy things, by needlessly going into debt, by oppressing those who are poor, you can come to poverty yourself. Okay, so there's a lot that we can learn about poverty just from Proverbs, but really this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot to take into account as we kind of form a biblical worldview of poverty. But just as I think, just for me, okay, so what do I take away from this? I was just thinking, do I think enough about the poor? Do I have the heart of Christ when it comes to loving for and caring for the poor? As I think about the growing problem of hunger in the world, especially with wars this year, do I think enough about this? Is it a burden that's on my heart? I'm concerned about the poor. I think let's ask the Lord, do not let us have a hard heart. I don't want to be someone who closes my ear to the cries of the poor. It takes a lot of wisdom to think that through, but let us not be hard-hearted. God is a God who cares for the poor, so we should as well. Okay, next theme that we see in the passages tonight, the chapters tonight, is about laziness. It's this very simple idea that comes up over and over. Laziness leads to poverty. I think it's interesting, actually, that these two themes are so prevalent, so close together, poverty and laziness. I want to clarify so much that poverty is not necessarily a sign of laziness. And I've said that a couple times, but just to reiterate, it's not a sin to be poor. But when you have the sin of laziness, that lifestyle leads somewhere. That leads to poverty. And the Bible is pretty blunt when it comes to laziness. And there are people who are lazy, and they would do well to listen to this. There's a tendency to want to put the blame on someone else. The Bible puts the blame, when you're lazy and you suffer the consequences, the blame falls on you. Listen to a couple of Proverbs about laziness. Proverbs 19:15. Slothfulness casts into a deep sleep, and an idle person will suffer hunger. Proverbs 20:4 says this, the sluggard does not plow in the autumn. He will seek at harvest and have nothing. In Proverbs 20:13, love not sleep, lest you come to poverty. Open your eyes, and you will have plenty of bread. And so there's a theme here. There's a rebuke theme we see. Someone who says, you know what, I just don't feel like working. Somebody else can pay my bills. That person is to be rebuked. That path leads to poverty. Another way to say it is this. When a lazy person goes hungry, whose fault is it? I think the Bible's pretty clear here. It's the fault of the lazy person. That's painting in broad strokes, I understand. But the Proverbs paint in broad strokes. And so I'm going to try and represent that. There is a worldview that's totally goes in the opposite direction in this. I have friends that subscribe to this kind of a worldview. It's a worldview that says If you are poor, there is only one explanation. The only explanation can be that the system is corrupt, that the government is corrupt, and they bear the blame for your poverty. Now, make no mistake, there are, as you think around the world, there are a lot of governments that are corrupt, and that leads to poverty. Maybe that even happens here some. But the Bible has no qualms about rebuking those who refuse to work. And it's wise for us to hear that. It's wise for us to evaluate our lives. Am I lazy? There's some pretty kind of almost comical descriptions of the sluggard in these chapters. Proverbs 22:13 says, the sluggard says, "There's a lion outside. I shall be killed in the streets." It's kind of this like, maybe someone else should do something about it. And you're like, well, you could go inside, but no. It's kind of like, there's a lion, I'm going to die, and that's a bummer. Yeah. Here's this one, Proverbs 19:24, kind of the same thing. A sluggard buries his hand in the dish and will not even bring it back to his mouth. Oh, woe is me. I guess I'll die from hunger. If only someone would pick up the fork and feed me. I guess I'm going to die. Like it's kind of a stinging rebuke of those who are a sluggard. Poetic ways of describing someone who refuses to work. So we see a couple things here. We see a rebuke to those who are, as we think about the poor and those who are lazy, and kind of think about how do we think about the poor and then those who are lazy. There's two rebukes to hear. The rebuke is, number one, to those who are cold-hearted towards those who are poor.